this conversation so that we can share it later. You know, my intention with the our 2020 initiative to help support the formation of community care groups where you live. My hope is that, you know, we'll start to get to know each other. I'm a little bit amazed because we were hoping for 20 individuals to sign up for this program that we put together. We were like, oh, cross our fingers, maybe we'll get 20, and 97 people have signed up, which is fascinating and just a really great sign, you know, about where everybody's head is at, and you know, really a focus on community education and volunteer work and things like that. And I'm just really, really heartened by everybody's response. So for me, it shifts a little bit, you know, how do you form community with 97 people on Zoom? Obviously not 97 people have showed up, but just know that that is the goal. So let's try to, you know, make an extra effort to ask some questions and just to put our voices out here in the circle so that we start to put a personality to the face in the square. And hopefully by the end of the year, we'll start to have a sense of who each other is and how we might want to further these relationships and keep working together. I'm so excited to have Professor Philip Olson with us from Virginia Tech. He and I have had some stimulating conversations about the home funeral movement, where we've come from, where we're headed. And I think that this conversation about context is particularly important in light of everything that's going on in the world right now. And, you know, I think, you know, there's been some conversation about us trying to figure out who we are and how we educate in these times and how the information that we have affects this culture of death and dying, especially as the culture is changing faster around us than we ever dreamed of being able to change it ourselves. So super excited to talk to you, Phil, and hear everybody else's questions. Angie's just gonna give us a little primer on Zoom etiquette and just how the context of the meeting will work, and then we'll go ahead and have our webinar. Go ahead, Ange.
Hi, everybody. So glad you guys are here. As Danny said, we are recording and we'll make this available to you all and others as the days go by. I am not that experienced at facilitating or helping to facilitate a meeting, so feel free to send me chat messages if you think there are things I could be doing better or things I'm missing. Be sure to mute yourself. If you don't, I will. And I can also unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. The way we'll handle questions is we hope that you will type your questions into the chat box, and I will be monitoring those, and then we'll bring them up when we get to the question and answer time. And we'll probably unmute you at that time if you've submitted a question, so that if there's any conversation that you want to have around that question, that can happen. Or if you just want to type in, I've got a question, it's too complicated, you know, just unmute me when it's my turn, then we can do that too. So just say you have a question or type your question in the group chat and we'll get you taken care of. We're supposed to go to for an hour. It's 5:08 now, so we do have the flexibility to go a little bit beyond that. That's still good for you, Dr. Olson, to go beyond 6 o'clock?
Yeah, that's fine. I can go later than that. That's fine.
Okay. So we'll just play that by ear, and if you have to go, then please do. But we do have some flexibility with that. Danny, did I miss anything? Oh, you're muted.
I was following the rules. I think you got it all.
Okay.
Yeah. So just I'm excited to hear what everybody has to say, and with no further ado, we will pass this over to you, Phil, and he's going to share his PowerPoint presentation for about half an hour-ish. We'll see, you know, sometimes those keep going, and then we'll ask questions when he's through. So thanks a lot. Go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming this evening, and thanks to Danny for inviting me. I hope you're all doing well. That your families and loved ones are doing well too. The pandemic's been hard on all of us, and it's still very early in this public health emergency, so please hang in there. I'm going to take my face off of here just so that there's kind of less distraction. 1 second. All right. So I'll give you a little bit of background, I guess, about myself first. So I grew up in a funeral family. My grandfather, my dad, my great-grandfather, they were all funeral directors in northern Minnesota. And I, worked as a night attendant and did all sorts of things for my dad's funeral home. And then in college, I worked at another funeral home, a different one, in Fargo, North Dakota, where I did all of those same things, but also worked as an embalming assistant. But I didn't really start researching death care until, or like in an academic way, until 2012. And since then, I've learned a lot about things that I took for granted growing up, about the history of death care, about environmental concerns related to death care practices, about gender and labor in the death care industry, and generally about human mortality and materiality. And a lot of this, I have to say, I've learned from you, from others I've met through the NHFA, and just home funeral guides and death, end-of-life doulas, death midwives, death doulas that I've talked to. So I'm now a certified death doula and home funeral guide, for what that's worth. There are lots of different certification programs. And I'm also a member of the NHFA, have been one since 2014. I served on the board of directors of the National Funeral Consumers Alliance, and I now find myself writing a book about the home funeral movement, a book that draws upon what I've learned from home funeral practitioners and advocates like yourselves. So I'm grateful to all of you for all of the things that you've taught me. So when I first titled this talk, the term context meant something different. So the context I had in mind has changed a lot since I first agreed to do this webinar. The present context is dominated by the coronavirus and the disease it causes, COVID-19. I had planned to talk about the home funeral movement's struggles with expertise in a couple of different senses. Like first, I mean, the movement's struggle against the dominant death care regime, in which the technical expertise of state-sanctioned funeral directors and embalmers, right, is dominant. And second, I mean the movement's struggle with its own relationship to expertise. I think the topic of expertise remains very important, but what I have to say is a bit different under the present circumstances. So I'm still going to talk about expertise, but I'm going to talk about it in a way that I hadn't planned to talk about it. So in the current context, interest in expertise isn't diminished. If anything, it's heightened, it's intensifying. We've all become familiar with one expert, Anthony Fauci. I'm sure you recognize his face there, whom I imagine most of us had never heard of before, right? The pandemic started. So just to give you just sort of to put a face on kind of the rising star of expertise during this time. With respect to funerals and other things, we non-experts are getting a lot of advice and information from actual experts, right? And the advice and information are changing as the experts learn more about the coronavirus and about COVID-19. And so this raises a number of, things like, wash your hands, wear a mask, keep 6 feet away, all this kind of advice we're getting. I start to think, like, how have our perspectives and practices changed on account of the information and advice promulgated by experts, particularly public health experts? And in particular, what have we learned about our funeral practices, and how has our understanding of the dead human body been shaped, right, in this moment? I'm only just starting to think through this stuff. Obviously, this pandemic is only, a couple months old, really. And so I can't possibly really offer answers, but I can hope to steer our attention maybe in some helpful directions. So we currently live in a culture in which the authority of so-called experts is almost automatically called into question. right? And there's some good reason for this, right? Because unquestioned expertise can harbor a lot of prejudice, right? So, I mean, thank God Jessica Mitford questioned the authority of funeral directors in her 1963 book, The American Way of Death. And thank God women have challenged physicians' expert authority over their bodies, especially their pregnant and birthing bodies, right? And thank God home funeral advocates have questioned the social and cultural norms and practices governing professional expert death care, right? Yet the questioning of expertise is not without its dangers, right? So we might fail to heed good advice, right? We might ignore, discount, or dismiss pertinent, even crucial information. I mean, just consider the pickle we're in now because some of our leaders, not just in the US, didn't listen closely enough, right, to the experts about the coronavirus and COVID-19. Right? And when we're putting expertise on trial, right, one thing that's the questions that really drive this are like whose knowledge counts, right, and whom can we trust? Countercultural funeral movements, so including the home funeral movement and the funeral consumers movement, have been built upon this kind of crucial and critical questioning of the expertise of professional funeral directors and embalmers and the grounds upon which funeral professionals have based their expertise. There's a lot of academic and popular literature about death and pollution, so like spiritual pollution, social pollution, biological pollution. And there's quite a lot of literature that deals with the relationship between medical science and mortuary science. I don't want to go into all of this stuff, though I'm happy to share sources if anybody wants to hear more about it, or we can unpack this stuff later this evening. But want to point out that professional healthcare and professional death care are linked, right, by a shared interest in public health, right? And one of my favorite thinkers, sociologist Deborah Lupton, says, you know, in public health discourse, the body is regarded as dangerous, problematic, ever threatening to run out of control, to attract disease, pose imminent danger to the rest of society. And under this public health model, medical experts aim to protect the social body, right, from people who are sick, from bodies that are sick. And, you know, for this reason, they're regulated by the government, right, because they have some kind of responsibility or they've been charged with the responsibility to protect the social body. And funeral experts, too, are regulated by the government, right? And I'll quote from Gilligan and Stoive's book, Mortuary Law, right? They're regulated by the government in order to promote public health. So public health is this really important sort of link between medicine and the funeral industry. So the public health conception of the dead body as this contaminating and dangerous object remains dominant in US death care culture. But around the turn of the 21st century, there's been a growing popularity of sort of alternative attitudes toward the corpse that's challenged this public health conception and has impacted the disposition practices that are being offered and provide a new basis for claims to authority, right, over the dead human body, right? So you have these ideas of the dead human body as being a healthful source of nutrients, like in green burial, right? This idea of returning to nature and then sort of feeding non-human nature, right? Or recompose, formerly known as the Urban Death Project, right? This idea of composting human remains and that compost being, you know, sort of harnessing its nutritive potential, right? And alkaline hydrolysis too. I mean, there have been conversations about the nutrient-rich qualities of the effluent that's produced by it. And I actually just recently ran into a story about a company that is providing alkaline hydrolysis services and giving families the effluent, which is a new thing. I mean, most people just give you back most providers of alkaline hydrolysis just give you back bone material, but this company is saying they'll give you the effluent, right, to fertilize your garden. Also views of the dead body as a natural and normal thing, right? So the death positive movement, the funeral consumer movement, the home funeral movement, right? Um, there are parallels here to, you know, the home birth movement, in which birth was viewed as a natural and normal thing, and that's something that's to be medicalized, right? And these challenges, right, these different ways of understanding the dead body really strike at the basis for certain claims to expertise and authority over human remains. So organizations like the NHFA, the FCA, the Green Burial Council, but also the National Funeral Directors Association or the Cremation Association of North America, I mean, all sorts of organizations are happy to cite the authority of public health experts, right? So it's, I mean, and it's nice to have sort of expert opinions on tap when needed, right? So to be able to sort of avail oneself of, you know, the judgments of say, you know, experts of various sorts, but say, you know, public health experts is what I want to focus on today. And we like our experts more on tap, but not always on top, especially when being on top means that they have or claim to have authority over us or talk down to us like we don't know anything, right? So we like having our experts on tap, you know, and the NHFA and the FCA, you know, frequently cite the CDC. And, you know, this, one of the, we're all familiar really with the standard line used to challenge the public health conception of the corpse, especially as that public health model has been used to promote embalming and other industrial death care practices, right? And that's the idea that corpses don't present novel public health dangers. In fact, corpses pose less of a danger than living bodies because corpses don't breathe, cough, or sneeze, right? So, and then this is directly from the CDC, right? It says, I won't quote this whole thing, but you know, it says here that the virus likely spreads primarily through respiratory droplets produced when an infected person coughs or sneezes. And this type of spread is not a concern after death, right? So here we have the CDC issuing a statement that's exactly in line with sort of the standard line that we get from, you know, the NHFA or the FCA about how corpses don't present novel public health dangers. I want to point out that there is a problem with the standard line. I'm not saying it's wrong. I think Mitford was right to challenge the rationale for embalming, like the public health or you know, rationale for embalming. It's, you know, touting its sanitary properties, right, or sanitary effects, sanitizing effects. The standard line, I don't think, it's not that it's false, it's that it's incomplete. And I think that this is because dead bodies exist in a social context, right? And corpses have a social life, right? They're not just passive objects, but they're really social actors, even though they are not autonomous agents. So I think that home funeral advocates acknowledge the corpse's agency in other ways, but when it comes to sort of talking about sort of the public health context, I think that this gets kind of dropped. Right? So there's a philosopher named Peter Paul Verbeek, and he's got this book about that deals with what things do, right? And things do things, right? And dead bodies do stuff too, right? So they bring people together, you know, for funerals. They make demands on us, right? They feed other things, this nutrient potential we were talking about earlier, right? And they poison other things, right, with body burden or when they're embalmed, right? So I just want to point this out because the public health status of a dead body is not a static or inherent feature of the corpse itself, right? The public health status of a dead body is partly a product of the culture in which that dead body lives, right? So kind of how the body acts in in certain cultural settings, right? It won't always act the same way in all settings. I just think that's something that's important to keep in mind. But back to the experts. So, like you, I've received statements from several organizations. Again, these are not public health experts, but lots of organizations seeking to reassure me that dead bodies carrying coronavirus are not a public health threat. And so, the FCA is not a public health expert or authority, and that's why the FCA cites the CDC as an authority on matters of public health and dead bodies. So I got an email, for example, from the FCA, and the subject line was "Facts, Not Fear, COVID-19 and the Dead." It just said this, right? On COVID-19, the CDC says this: there is currently no known risk associated with being in the same room at a funeral or visitation service with the body of someone who died of COVID-19. And then there's a link to the CDC document. But there's more from the CDC. So look here. For some reason, the FCA didn't cite this passage from the CDC's guidance about funerals and COVID-19. I'm not sure why, but I'll just read some of these underlying parts here. So one thing that the CDC states is that people should consider not touching the body of someone who has died of COVID-19, and that certain activities such as kissing, washing, or shrouding should be avoided before, during, and after the body has been prepared, if possible. Families are encouraged to work with their community's cultural and religious leaders and funeral home staff on how to reduce their exposure as much as possible. So, these are statements also that the CDC is making at this time regarding funerals, dead bodies, and the coronavirus. So the CDC is in effect giving the nod, right, to certain people as reliable sources of information and guidance. And it's referring in this previous statement here to two different groups of experts in particular, right? And that is cultural and religious leaders and funeral home staff. Which I think is pretty interesting. And the question is, who's got the important knowledge, right? And the CDC is saying, well, if you're trying to figure out what to do at the funeral, here are the people to turn to, right? The cultural and religious leaders, right? They'll help you with the sort of spiritual side of things, and they can help you deal with questions about, like, say, spiritual pollution or something like that, right? Funeral home staff are going to be there, as we saw earlier, from the Gilligan and Stoive quote from the book on mortuary law, right? They're there to protect the public health, right? Is the idea, right? So the CDC is covering these two bases. But notice that they don't refer to licensed funeral directors and embalmers, right? Of course, non-licensed employees can have decades of experience, right, in the funeral industry. So, having a license, in, funeral service or an embalming does not having a license in that doesn't mean that you don't know what you're talking about. And also notice that they don't refer people to the FCA or to the NHFA, right? They refer people to cultural and religious leaders or funeral home staff. So, to whom does the CDC give guidance? This is another side of things, right? That the folks here in this list, right, are the folks whom the CDC acknowledges as the real players in the enactment of public health authority, right? So, they give guidance to funeral directors and embalmers, to pathologists and morgue workers, physicians and organ transplant technicians, and some limited information and guidance is written for groups who wash and shroud their own dead. No specific guidance is given for home funeral practitioners or home funeral guides. Um, so one thing to ask ourselves might be, how can the NHFA get acknowledgement from the CDC, right? How can the home funeral movement get this kind of acknowledgement, right? That they're people that the CDC can reach out to, that they can provide some guidance for, right? Does the NHFA or the home funeral movement want this kind of acknowledgement, right? I mean, I don't know. That's something that I think we need to think about. So I want to raise a question that I can't give an answer to. And I can't give an answer to it because it's a matter of really social movement identity. So it's not for me to answer, but it's a question anyway to think about in this context, right? And that's should the CDC refer families to the NHFA or home funeral guides or home funeral educators, right? They're referring people to spiritual guides, right? Cultural and religious leaders, and to funeral staff, right? As a movement that advocates a very hands-on approach to death care, what do we do when the experts, are telling us, hands off? Right? So what is the social role of the NHFA or the home funeral movement in general at a time like this, right? I mean, something to think about is, are we experts, right, to whom the public can turn for information and guidance, right, with respect to death care? And this really kind of, raises this very, it's an old question in the home funeral movement, right, about expertise, right? So some things that I would like for us to think about, and I think the current context sort of prompts us to think about these things is, what do we know? And when I say we here, I don't have a fixed idea about whom that includes or doesn't include. In fact, I think the home funeral movement is composed of a lot of different we's. So I don't have any particular thing in mind here. That's why I've got it in scare quotes. But what do we know about the responsible care of the dead during the pandemic, right? So I'm thinking here of things that the CDC, funeral directors, or cultural and religious leaders don't know. So what can we put our finger on as being the sorts of things that we, as home funeral advocates, know, right? And then what sort of social obligations attach to our expert knowledge if we indeed see ourselves as experts, right? How should we enact that expertise, right? So possessing expertise, sort of believing that you have it, is a different thing than sort of enacting it. So expertise isn't just kind of a matter of having knowledge, but it's also a social role, right, that one plays, right? And that comes with responsibilities, but it also comes with sort of practical demands about how you actually enact that expertise, how you exercise it. And if we're experts, right, then how does that affect our relationship to public health experts? Right? Should they acknowledge us? Should they direct the public to us? Right? If we're not experts, if we don't want to think of ourselves as possessing a certain kind of expertise, should we proffer advice about proper precautions for after death care practices during the pandemic? Should we be doing that? Should we assert that no special expert knowledge is necessary to care for the dead during the pandemic? So we in the movement have been pretty sanguine about, making mistakes while caring for the dead. I remember, I don't know how many of you were at the biennial meeting in Los Gatos, California, but the final sort of roundtable or group discussion at that meeting, as I remember, was about sort of home funeral kind of mistakes and goof ups, right? And people sharing their kind of mistakes and being, saying that we got to be able to forgive ourselves. We're not experts, we're kind of just figuring this stuff out ourselves, right? And I'm having a very kind of easygoing sort of idea about making mistakes. But in the pandemic, right, mistakes mean something different, right? So if we're not experts, you know, should we be sort of, you know, okay with kind of this, you know, this sort of very kind of open and easygoing attitude about sort of mistakes, or, you know, how do we want to talk about mistakes, right? Do we want to change our language there, or sort of rethink kind of the way in which we talk about that? And if we're not experts, how would that affect our relationship to, you know, public health statements about care for the dead, like the ones that I was quoting here earlier from the CDC. And I mean, this is really all I have, is just trying to help us to kind of think about how we as a movement kind of appeal to authority or to experts, right? Public health experts, right? But then also how we resist them, and there are these tensions there with, you know, other experts, right? And then also tensions with our own kind of sense of our own expertise and whether we possess it or not, right? Whether it's you know, a certain kind of expertise is required to conduct home funerals or not, right? So these are old questions. I'm not raising anything terribly new. I'm just trying to sort of frame them in a different context now. So thanks for your time. I want to just conclude by saying that, you know, just like we shouldn't view corpses as inert, undynamic, sort of passive objects that either are or are not in themselves dangerous, because dead bodies actively and persuasively shape the social world, sort of depending on what world they occupy. In the same way, I think that we shouldn't view expertise as a static, sort of fixed social status. It either is or is not itself desirable. Expertise or inexpertise of some sort can actively and persuasively shape the social world, right? Depending on how it participates in that world. And I think that's something that we need to think about, is how we want to participate, right, in the social world and in the culture of death care, right, and sort of how to think about ourselves as experts or not. So thank you, and stay well. Thanks.
Thank you. Wow. That is a lot to think about.
That is a lot to think about. Okay, let's, did I do it? Ooh, look at what I did. Okay. Wow. Okay, I'm going to start off with just asking some questions and bouncing some things back to you, and take that time a little bit, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. So I want to start first with the last thing. And I think it's really, you know, Phil, you and I have had conversation about expertise and all of that stuff. And I think that, that it is one of the biggest questions that we sort of grapple with in this movement. And I guess it's interesting to me, and I wonder if you'd talk about this a little more, that the expertise is so important, and yet at the same time, the CDC seems to leave it vague. And I wonder if you have thoughts about how our relative expertise as home funeral guides or home funeral educators, and I know that's different, you know, my relative expertise might be different than anybody else's on this call, but it seems to me that the CDC left it a little bit open. Like, it's probably fine up there at the top, and then down at the bottom, it's not okay. And then consult your cultural leaders, you know, which, you know, someone said in the comments, and I think it's true, we see ourselves as, you know, at least cultural effectors, if not leaders at this point, but desire to be cultural leaders. And so I guess that's my long rambling way of just asking, like, how particularly important is expertise in this moment when we're just balancing not even knowing what's true and what's not true? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd like to open that up to the group, that question, because I don't have I don't have any answers to that, I guess. You know, so I mean, the CDC seems to have some pretty specific things to say. I think I'm not sure how vague it is, right? When they say don't kiss, don't wash, don't shroud. Like those are very specific kinds of activities, right? Like holding hands, they say that's okay, right? Don't kiss, don't wash, don't shroud. Like those are very specific activities, right? And I mean, I don't know what they had in mind, but you know, the first thing that comes to my mind are sort of traditional Jewish and Muslim, you know, funeral services, right? Where you're washing and shrouding or casketing bodies, right? You know, the people who are doing it are not, you know, licensed funeral directors, right? They're community members who are doing this. And we've always been doing this, right? The same way, right? And they're just saying, you know, the circumstances are different, so you know you just got to be more careful now, right, with things like that. And we recommend that you don't do it. If you got to do it, we're not going to, you know, tell you. We're not going to say, you know, don't practice your, you know, sacred traditions, right? We're going to say consult with your religious and cultural leaders, and they may tell you, you know, yeah, maybe this isn't, you know, maybe we do have to make exceptions, right, for the time being, right? You know, but consult with them, get their advice on it, right, to sort of find a comfortable place to be. That's how I was reading it. And then consult with funeral directors, right, to see what, you know, what their thoughts are on kind of the treatment of the body. But those are the two groups that are consulted, right? We might see ourselves as spiritual leaders, cultural leaders, um, religious leaders. I don't know. Maybe some of us do, right? But the CDC does not have the NHFA in mind when it makes that statement, right? The CDC does not have the home funeral movement in mind when it makes that statement. I think that's the thing to get clear on, is sort of who the CDC is thinking of as the enactors of public health authority, right? Like who they're willing to sort of share this kind of burden with, right? And we're not on the radar, right? And part of the question is, do we want to be?
Right. And I see Sarah Jane is raising her hand.
Sarah's got some, yeah.
I want to just wrap that up though, because I think what was interesting was you said that line about who can we trust?
Yeah.
And what happens when, so I wrote the question of like, what happens when expertise goes against basic human need? And I wonder if that's sort of the gray area that got left when they brought up asking religious leaders and culture. It's like allow your religious leaders to weigh if the circumstances of this death warrants the risk that the ritual would bring about, but that the ritual might be so important for the mental and spiritual health of this family that it's like this weighing.
Yeah. For the community. Yeah.
Sarah, Sarah Jane, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself and share your thoughts?
Okay. Yeah. Hi. You said you wanted to open it to the floor for thoughts. So what was interesting to me about the language, because you guys seem to have a different perspective on the language, what I saw from the language that the CDC used was, it seemed like they were saying, in this new world, with COVID bodies, no one has the expertise, which is why they're using the consult language rather than listen to. And they're very careful to say that you have to make these decisions for yourself, essentially. So I think in those terms, when we're thinking about what is the expertise of something as nebulous as the NHFA, obviously it would be useful for us to make it clear to the nation, the world, and of course the CDC, that our expertise lies within reclaiming the thing that doesn't exist anymore, which is you go to the funeral home, they prepare the body for you, you get to interact with it, you get to do this with non-COVID bodies. It is so obvious that obviously the NHFA and neither is funeral homes experts on what to do with COVID bodies. Our expertise lies in what to do to reclaim those rituals with non-COVID bodies within your social cell, within your social isolation cell. So if you're home with a dead body, and this is not a COVID a death, this was an expected attended death, and now previously you were going to call the funeral home and they were going to provide you with a wake and a viewing and a ceremony. Our expertise lies in, you don't have to hand that body over until you have had a wake and a viewing and a ceremony. And then you can, if you still wish to not have natural burial, you still wish to do all of the things that you were going to do, but that you no longer will have access to the body afterwards, then our expertise is in, great, now you can send that off to the funeral home. And you no longer feel like you were robbed, because for a long time, we've been showing people how to do this themselves, as long as it's in that same realm of our expertise, which is outside of COVID bodies and outside of social cells merging, because obviously if you're going to be hands-on, it's going to have to be with people that have been around the person who has died within the quarantine time, essentially. I'm rambling, so I hope that was clear.
Well, and I'm really glad that you bring that up, because the thing that I've been thinking a lot about, Sarah Jane, is almost the inverse of that, of like the possibility of people ending up with bodies at home who never wanted that. And I've been asking myself that question probably more than any other question of, how do we get our existence or our knowledge in the hands of people who, in some areas where somebody dies and a funeral director can't get there for a few days because they're so backed up. How do we help normalize that experience? To me, that's where there's something interesting possible.
Yeah, did you see that article about it was an Italian TV star or movie star, and there was an article that the headline was like that he was stuck at home with a corpse, right? And when I saw that, I was thinking, like, oh no, like, it's like, oh, horrible, I mean, this is the message, right, of the article, right? It's like, oh, horrible for this person, right, to be stuck at home with his dead body. It's like, is that such a bad thing, right? Like, if only he knew what to do, right? This could be wonderful, right? Like, it wouldn't be a bad thing. So, like, what you're saying, Sarah, I mean, this idea that, like, there's an opportunity, right, for outreach in a way here. Not that anybody wants this, but like the idea that, like, look, if you are, as it were, stuck at home, right, with a dead body, there are people who are prepared to help you sort of work through that situation, right?
Totally. I see Michelle was trying to raise her hand, but couldn't. Michelle, do you still want to share?
Hi, everybody. This is pretty amazing that we're all together here asking these questions. I just find this so connecting and reassuring for myself that we're all out here together trying to make things work for those. We're a service, so that's the biggest thing. I don't know if you knew about a webinar that happened for 3 days called the Unfuneral. It was a bunch of funeral directors coming together, trying to figure out what to do and what to say and where people are headed, including the owner of legacy.com. So I was on the call the last day, and they brought up the CDC, considering last week as of April 1st, week 10, W-E-E-K, week number 10, saying that the death rate is down 18%. And that I found that really fascinating, that they had this 18% and it's down. It's like, how is that really kind of possible? And then they're saying it's probably due to less car accidents happening on the road because we're all staying home, and that there's no spread of the regular flu happening right now. So I found that really fascinating. And the other thing is, and I hope this is okay to share, my company, Beautiful Dying Expo, is putting together information that we're doing right now to the public. And we are giving them all the information we possibly can give them so that they have answers to the questions that, we have some of those answers already. But to be able to say, we're here and we're here together And we're doing these kind of like 20-minute segments through all the way through to November, where the expo is going to be virtual. So I just wanted to share that out there, that we do have ways to be able to take what we're questioning and what we're doing out to the public through Beautiful Dying Expo. It's a virtual reality type of trade show, and it's really going to bring who we are and what we're doing to the public. I just wanted to share that.
Great, thanks. Let's see, Susie, I was seeing you wave your hand. Was that an attempt to raise your hand analog style? Go for it, friend.
Myself. Okay, so I'm going by the question that we mentioned on the interpretation of the CDC, which brought up my own question on because like I feel like there's a way where we could embrace the concept of being an expert without there being like a value judgment enmeshed in that, because when I hear the word expert, I know that a lot of the problem that comes with the term of being expert or knowing something is somehow implies that someone is somehow less than you and there's a value judgment place. And so how do we embrace that title of being an expert while losing those enmeshed value judgment, where we can reach out to the CDC and other health experts and stuff like that, so we can see ourselves at least as a resource for that they can give to other people? Because a lot of what I see with the CDC is like, one, they could not really know about us much because we are fairly new with the home funeral movement. Also, I mean, we have to consider they're fighting a pandemic right now, and you know, in the fourth probably isn't all these other social things, which I think is totally important. As someone who's involved in intersectionality and social justice work, I understand all of this is important, but I'm guessing when you're low on resources fighting a pandemic, you're mind on fighting the pandemic. So like my question is, how do we embrace that so we can be a resource and start, like you said, so we can actually reach out to them? Because like one way we can do it is there's a phone number, there's an email, we can start talking. How do we make it comfortable for us on how we introduce ourselves?
I think that's a great question. I'd love to start, for those of us that are on that Facebook thread for this particular group, to maybe open that up as a conversation there. And I hear two possible responses in that. One is just like, how do you grapple with your own title or identity as you do this work as an educator? And just, I'd love to keep that conversation happening on the Facebook page, and I'll start that when we end this call, just to keep hearing people's ideas around that. And then the other one just being, you know, what I grapple with the most is, before this whole thing was going on, I was teaching a lot and people were showing up to hear these things and were really excited about it. And now not knowing how to reach people. You know, it's easy to reach the people who are already part of the conversation, but how do we, with social distancing and, you know, not gathering, continue to reach out to people who are going to need this information? So those are two threads that I'd love to see sort of continued, you know, in the Facebook room or on email for those that aren't Facebooking. So, oh, go ahead.
What I was saying is, like, how do you guys interpret the value judgment as being an expert? Because I'm noticing, like, a lot of the things like he mentioned is like, we do mistakes, we don't see ourselves as experts, and why don't we? And what is this inherent connotation in the word expert that makes us not want to be associated with it too? Is a thing worth thinking about.
Yeah, I think that there's a, you know, I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent. For me, when I think a lot about that, it's like home funeral guides and home funeral educators trying really hard not to create another business that people need to access to gain or need to use to gain access to their own dead. And I think that that's what, I think some of us really want to get paid for this work, and some of us have found really amazing ways to get paid for this work. And I think that somewhere in that conversation about whether or not we're experts, is that question of, like I always teach and I say, like, there's this thing in my pocket that I have and it belongs to you. It was never mine. This is information that belongs to like our humanity, and how do we give that back to our culture rather than own it? And I think with the question of expertise comes the conversation of money, which is a really interesting conversation in all of this that I don't think we have time to totally dive into right now.
I know.
It's a really important conversation, and I think that with a lot of validity, everyone's going to have their own answer. Sarah Cruz, I see your candle.
Hi. So, yeah, I mean, I think that, what you're getting at is the word expert is often associated with being a professional. And so that's where that piece comes in. But, I took a photo of that page with the more from the CDC. And the language, while it's specific, it's also still a little bit, there's some wiggle room in there. So people should consider not touching the body of someone who has died of COVID. And then later on, other activities such as kissing, washing, and shrouding, as you pointed out, should be avoided. It doesn't say absolutely don't do that. And then it says, if washing the body or shrouding are important religious or cultural practices, that's when families are encouraged to get with their community cultural leaders or religious leaders and funeral home staff to learn how to reduce their exposure as much as possible. And I think all of us are learning that. Like, we're figuring it out. We're having conversations with funeral directors, and they know as much as we do in terms of limiting your exposure. So then they go on to say, if you're going to engage in these activities, wear gloves, put a mask on, maybe put a mask on the deceased. We've heard all of that. So I'm not sure that I'm just pointing it out that there is room for our expertise, like who was it that was saying, Sarah Jane, whether it's a COVID death or not. But there's so much of this is based on fear. And of course, right now, fear is heightened in ways that are hard to grapple with. Fear of people dying alone and all of these things. And could we even get the body back to the house if they die in a hospital, or, what? Anyway, I don't know. I just feel like we do have a level of expertise in knowing that being around dead bodies is okay and that we can do this. That's what I have to offer.
I think that was really important. Thank you for clarifying that in that way. That's really good to hear. Yeah. Let's see. Angie, are you moderating this long comment here? Is that coming up?
But before that,
Okay.
and forgive me if I'm skipping around here, Jennifer had asked if she was off the call for a few minutes and was wondering if anyone, which we haven't, have addressed the work of death doula, death midwife care being done virtually. So that's one thing that's hanging out there. I'm not sure that Nidra has, Nidra, did you want to say something? Did you want to address your comment here? You can unmute yourself if you do.
Thank you. And thank you for all of this organization. I am an end of life doula and wish to become a home funeral guide in the future. That's why I've been a member of NHFA. In my comment, I mentioned Sarah Williams, where many of you probably know her from other webinars. We created a community care group in North Carolina, the Piedmont, the central part of North Carolina, 2 weeks and 2 days ago, and have poured blood, sweat, and tears into a 12-page document that we just started releasing today, titled Care for Those Who Die at Home in Pandemic Times. Being that Sarah is a little bit more active and is a home funeral guide, whereas I am not yet, I may defer to her to get this document into all of your hands. I don't know what her plan is. I haven't been able to talk to her about it yet because we just released it today. But we do address having people dying or having died in the home, giving them guidelines under various headers, whether they had COVID-19 or not, and what to do when outside help may be a day or two away, or 3 or more days away, like when you're completely on your own and you're going to be burying your grandmother in the backyard. That's how far we take it.
That would be a great resource.
Yeah.
To share.
Thank
And
you.
we'll also be putting up on the on our Facebook page the document that was created by the folks in Minnesota with Ann Murphy and Linda Berg, worked on a great document that they're making available for everyone to edit for their own communities. So it starts off as a document that's relevant to Minnesota, but it's a great, like my Arizona community death care group reworked their same document to put in resources that are relevant here, and they were really open to sharing that way. So I'll make sure that that's available to everybody as well. Phil, I have another question that's a little bit shifting the angle a little bit. If someone needs to cycle back to where we are right now, that's fine. But I've just been thinking a lot about just the idea of culture, and I think of the NHFA, that really, whether we can have, hundreds of home funeral guides, but unless we do some work of actually shifting the culture so that people want home funerals and see home funerals as part of their family story, as part of their family culture, that it doesn't matter how many of us there are until we actually do that work of changing the culture. And, in a time of pandemic like this, I see people wanting to sort of make predictions about what's happening or how this is changing the culture, and what we might expect moving forward, how death is being impacted. And we're not that far into it right now to make predictions about culture, but I wonder if you would talk a little bit as someone who looks at culture, how and when might we start to assess the impact of our role or the impact of this movement on death and dying in our culture moving forward? Wait, are you talking? Don't talk. Let's see.
All right.
There we go. I unmuted you.
Yeah, sorry. I was talking. No, I forgot everything I was going to say. So, well, it's a great question. And I think that it's tough. I've been thinking about this during the whole Q&A is like, how do you sort of, part of it is this question of getting on the radar, right? So that when things happen, like, there are, people who are quote unquote stuck at home with dead bodies, right? How do you get to the point where the next step in thought is to jump to, there are people who do that. There are people who know how to deal with that, right? I know so that there's a sort of habit of thought where the next thing that occurs to you, right? is that there are home funeral guides. There are home funeral sort of experts or helpers or something like that, right? How do you get to the point where that's like the next sort of association, right? And that is not a quick thing. That is not an easy thing. That takes a really long time. And it's a network thing. It's a matter of building relationships with other kinds of actors in the environment. So, and I mean big actors, right? That everybody listens to. So this is why I wanted to talk about the relationship with the CDC, right? Because people are listening to what the CDC says right now, right? And they're listening to what Fauci says, right? How do you get something like home funerals, right, to be something that is on their radar, like something that they think about and something that they mention, right? That there are people in your communities, right, who are, you know, able to do or to help you with this kind of situation, right? And that it's not an emergency, it's not a dangerous sort of thing, as long as, you know, there's, you know, there are people who kind of know what the risks are and how to deal with them, right? And the thing about like the thing you have in your pocket that other people, that belongs to other people, right? It's not yours, it belongs to them, and you're happy to give it to them, right? There still needs to be that transfer, right? So it's not as though it's in their pocket and they just need to sort of pull it out, right? They don't just recollect the sort of information that's been, or these skills, right? These capacities, right? To care for their own dead. They don't just sort of recollect that or figure it out themselves, right? I mean, this is something that, you know, people need practice with, right? And you know, it's gonna take a long time. But I mean, this is what, if you look at the history of something like the National Funeral Directors Association and the kind of networks that it established, with the legal sort of establishment, right, with government agencies, with other kinds of corporate entities, with technology manufacturers, right, Dow Chemical, I mean, these huge sort of actors, right? That's how they came to be where they are, right? As they built up huge social networks with other kinds of organizations, right? They were on everybody's radar, right? And that's something that, like, if we want to do that, if we want to be sort of kind of the next thought, right? If we want to be the thing that people go, oh yeah, of course that's what you do, right? This is part of our way of thinking, right? This is part of our culture, right? Our sort of habits of thought and action, right? If you want to do that, then there's got to be more of this social networking, right? And in a really big way. I don't know how to do that. I mean, the only thing I could say, because I'm not a like a social movement leader or anything like that. The best I could do is to offer accounts, right, of sort of how this happened. I mean, you could read like Gary Lauderman's book on, oh God, what's it called? Rest in Peace, right? About the formation of the the FDA, right? And kind of how it came about, how it's, I mean, a lot of it, and I know this isn't terribly popular stuff, was about licensing and standardization. That goes a long ways. Like licensing and standardization, especially standardization, like makes like a huge difference, right? And that's a really hard sell to an organization in which there are a lot of different we's, right? A lot of different groups, a lot of different ways of thinking about the movement. Like Danny, you were just saying earlier, right, that your expertise, right, is going to differ from other people's expertise, right? but then what we don't have there is a standard, right? And that's, I mean, just looking at the history, right? Organizations and sort of social movements, right? I mean, like standardization is a big thing. So I'll just leave it there.
Right. Well, and when because I think about it a lot, as the person in the leadership position of this organization right now, I think a lot about like sort of existing in this middle sandwich place of the information spreads on a national level, right? And we're doing a lot of social media and things like that, but those feel really impersonal. So there's a way that the message spreads sort of on a very impersonal national level. And then there's this other way that it spreads that's way slower, but more impactful, which is human to human, right? Which is part of the impetus for this group, which is like, if everybody here goes out and talks to however many people, that eventually, and I'm willing to stick in for the long haul, we shift the culture. And, it reminds me of the conversation that you and I had about, the connection with our movement and the home birth movement, again, being more grassroots and the challenges that we had with licensing and whatnot in the home birth movement. And, it's like, we're not Dow Chemical, we're not looking to sort of be in the culture as this new normal or this new expert, right? We're here to kind of say families are the expert. And that's, I think, going to be our biggest crux. And that's where the interesting question, like the challenge for me, the mind-blowing moment is like, how do we become experts when our message so much is that families are experts?
So so the thing, and please, I don't want to monopolize time here. If other people have things to say, I'm happy to shut up. I'm just thinking about I've lost my train of thought now. Darn it.
Well, and Nina just said it, and I think you talked about like the transfer, right? The transfer of the thing from my pocket to the thing that's now in their pocket. And I know, and I don't know if you want to say more about that, Nina, because I see you just commented in experts at helping families be the experts, right? And so, right, and we have to get there without usurping power, right? It's like we don't want to become another power over force in the culture. But it seems like a lot of the ways that people become experts is to have some sort of power over in their ideas about how things have done. And we don't want to do that. And so I think that's where this dance comes in and it's why it'll be slower. And I think we all just have to be ready for it to be slower.
I remember what I was going to say.
Good.
Very quick about it. So there are two different things, right? We can be a home funeral movement, right? So our issues are about, helping people learn how to care for their own dead, right? Or we could tackle a much bigger social issue like knowledge society, right? A society in which we are very much dominated by a kind of expert culture, right? And that is a much broader and bigger issue. I don't think that the NHFA is positioned to tackle that bigger issue, right? Not yet, right? I don't see it that way. That is that's too big, right? So if we are going to say, look, we live in a knowledge culture, and what we need to do is we need to find a way to shift things, to nudge things sort of within that framework, right? In a way that's going to kind of steer things in a way that's favorable to home death care, right? Then what do we do? The bigger thing about the bigger social critique or cultural critique about knowledge culture, right, is vast and enormous. And we are very, very small. That's not to say that it's pointless to try to shift things that way. We can contribute to the development of that discourse, right? But I think that an expectation that we're going to shift out of this kind of knowledge culture, right, that this movement is going to break through that, right, and out of that. I think I'm suspicious of that. And I fear that that might not be the most productive thing. But then again, I'm not a social movement expert, right? I'm not a social movement leader, right? I don't, I'm not a politician or anything like that. So I don't, like, those sorts of activities are kind of beyond my scope.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. It's sort of like my mind's going, it's great. Great.
Well, and Sarah Cruz in the comments mentions normalization, maybe normalization, not versus, but instead of maybe standardization. Do you have any thoughts about that, Dr. Olson? Or anybody else? And there's lots of comments in the string too, just about ways to go about doing that, about the normalization and publicity around the movement, which, we're talking about in a never-ending fashion. And for those of you who have strong feelings about that and ideas, the board welcomes your help with that too. So, let us know if you want to be a part of our education
What's
or
the
our
difference?
communications group.
What's the difference, Sarah, between normalization and standardization? What are you driving at there?
I guess I'm driving at, the idea of standardization and how that was really important in the professional funeral industry, correct? I mean, that was what you were referring to, this book that this guy wrote, and how they reached out to all these other groups and, standardized sort of the level of care, I guess. And with home funerals, it's different with every home funeral. It depends on so many things. So really normalizing the stories, on getting people in our culture to understand that this is something that's possible and it's going to look different in every single circumstance. We can't really set a standardization of care because that's impossible. That's like trying to fit every funeral into a neat little box and this is how it's going to work. So it's more important in my mind that we normalize these conversations around it, that it becomes a thing where people know through hospice or whoever that, oh, really? I could do that? And no longer are they asking, oh, is that legal? Oh, I didn't know you could do that. But it becomes like a normalized thing in our society. So that's where I think the difference is.
So that makes sense to me. So one thing to keep in mind is that no industrial funeral is the same either. They are very, very different, right? They're always different. And funeral directors are more and more sort of seeing themselves not as body technicians, but as event planners, right? And they're there to plan the event that you want, right? And you listen to them, they say, if you want hot air balloons, I'll do what I can to get them, right?
Right.
Anything you want, right? So they want it to be very personalized. They want them to be very sort of different. The standardization is not there, right? But in something like education, right? And techniques. So the way that the funeral industry standards came to shape kind of cultural expectations, right? A lot of that was through the training of professionals, the education they got. There is a standard curriculum, right, for these people, so that there are certain kind of expectations that people say, well, when I go to a funeral, here's what I know they know, right? Or they can be held accountable for knowing certain things, right? And those sort of standards go a long way in terms of sort of establishing public trust, right? And social and governmental authority, right? Legal authority.
Sure. I guess there are certain standards, like we know how to keep a jaw closed, in a non-invasive way, and keep eyes closed, and, how to bathe the body and move it from one spot to another. And, you know, there's certain standards that I think that we all work from in that way.
Susie, I see you've got your hand up, but Sarah Jane, you wanted to chime in on this conversation?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about normalization and how we actually do have an example of someone trying to normalize our message. So normalization obviously requires repetition of message, which requires a kind of virality of the message. People are going to share it and share it and share it. And the kind of things that people share are the kind of things people are attracted to, obviously, the clickbaity type things. We like things that are packaged in a, look at this inside information, look at this thing nobody knows, look at this thing that's going to save you money, look at this sexy thing said by a sexy person. I mean, that's what people click. So we had, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but Adam Ruins Everything. He did an entire episode exposing the funeral industry and talking about, you know, the practices of it and how unnecessary it is and how bad it is for the environment. Caitlin Doty was in a segment on the episode, and that's a prime example of our message. It's called, someone said Adam Who, the show is called Adam Ruins Everything. That's an example of our message, our actual message receiving a viral treatment in normalization. I saw it shared, I mean, this was a while ago. It got shared virally. It's still up. You can still see it. I think the episode's free on YouTube. But so that's kind of what it looks like. But even with that huge victory and a really great, very funny show by, you know, young, intelligent people, even with that viral piece of normality that we can point to and say, that's what it looks like when our message catches fire and the common public is sharing it and enjoying it and consuming it as entertainment, it still doesn't feel like we've gotten very far. But I just wanted to bring that to the group's attention.
I think that's a great point.
Susie? Unmute you here. Don't talk yet.
Okay.
There we go. There we go.
Sorry.
Yes.
So I'm answering what you said on the normalization and how we go about in like preserving ourselves in what we're trying to do in the pandemic. And I'm actually an ethnic studies major, so a lot of the stuff I look into, and even I'm part of minority cultures that are also getting hit by the pandemic and are asking these questions as well. Is like, how do we preserve our rituals? How do we preserve all these things while we can't be in contact with each other when our rituals are community-based and it involves people and it involves human-to-human contact, face-to-face work. And so one of the things I've been doing to help this is looking towards what they're doing. Like, how are they preserving their cultures? What do they use? Because you even a good example of how you can do like death work, and I've been talking to my godfather about this, is like, I want to give an example. Like in slavery, a lot of loved ones lost the body of their loved ones because they were sold out and this and that. So they would have to do rituals of death that were probably long distance and honoring them without ever having the body. And so these cultures have ways to honor that. I know in my culture, in the spiritual path I'm part of, we have altars that represents the body and the dead loved one without having the body or the dead loved one. So there are rituals in cultures that have ways that they've survived colonization, slavery, and natural death by different rituals to revitalize themselves in this way. And you could even see movements where I forgot which one, like it blew up in Twitter where they were trying to get a message out of some discrimination going on in a different part of the world where the only access of communication they had was Twitter. So there's ways of using social media and ritual to do cultural movements and cultural change.
Yep, I think that's really well said, Susie. Thank you.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, I think a lot of what the NHFA is sort of founded on is this idea that there's old rituals, right? Old, you know, forgotten elements of our cultures and others' cultures that are relevant, you know, in the ways that we find ourselves, you know, not feeling satisfied by what the culture, you know, what our practices and behaviors have to offer us right now. So I'm going to start to wind this down. It's 6:24 and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. This has been really, you know, I didn't exactly know what to expect, and I really appreciate everybody's voices at the table. I've got a lot to think about. I think that the NHFA is doing a great job of normalizing this practice. And I think that it's just a balance that we're trying to find. And I think what we, as people who hope to be community educators, I think that's the common thread of all of us being here and realizing that we have an impact to make in our communities. You know, there's some great voices in this movement that are doing an amazing job of getting on the national stage. You know, there's Lee Webster and Shar Barrett and so many people, you know, on that level who are doing an amazing job of getting you know, published in Newsweek and New York Times and things like that. And those things are super important, but we can't forget the important impact that you all are going to make in your communities. And so that's sort of what I was talking about, is that top down, and then we can kind of be the bottom up to really, you know, spread this movement like wildfire in the places that we live with the people that we're talking to. And my hope is that through these conversations, we all can become familiar with the standards and the normalized practices that are available through, you know, the NHFA's website and whatnot, to help inform the information that we're sharing with people as we talk about what's possible.
Yeah, and I would just want to add on to that, Danny, that as a part of normalizing these conversations, I have found the podcasts to be just wonderful tools for those conversations that Sarah is having with people are just so easy to listen to. And I plan on listening to them with folks and maybe even having some listening parties. I know that's a small way, but it's just one of the many, like somebody mentioned earlier, somebody has to see a message 7 times before it starts to like break through. And that is just one of the ways and one of the tools that we can use for normalization. So if you haven't listened to those, please, and if you need help finding them, let any of us know and we can help you do that.
It's a path home. It's called A Path Home.
Thank you.
And it's the NHFA podcast, and you can find it on our website and on Facebook. And I find it a great tool specifically to share with people who are like, you want to do what? Like, that's weird. And then they can listen to those stories and it's really helpful. So everyone stay safe, wash your hands, move slow. And yeah, I just hope that you're finding connection where it's available. And I hope that, you know, in these conversations that we continue to just find it together. Yeah, big love, big love. And then I'll just invite everybody next, what is it? April 23rd, we'll meet here again in the Zoom room. That one is a paid webinar. It's $10 to register. Please email me, danny@homefuneralliance.org. If you can't find the link to register for that, I'll help you find it. But it is in your newsletter and on Facebook. And we'll be talking to Zenith Virago, who is just a hoot, wild woman from down under. And she is just going to talk about, you know, cultivating the wild spirit as we do this work, being a community organizer, and and how you really make that magic happen where you live. So really looking forward to that. Really looking forward to being with you all together. And then our next community care group webinar will be, I think it's May 3rd, and we will have a panel of people who are already running community care groups or threshold circles to just talk about the different ways that they run their groups, different ways that they share responsibility and have been reaching out in their hometowns during this time. So I hope that y'all will make it. And I will send you all the link to that community care group panel webinar, you'll get that in your email, and I'll also post it on the Facebook page. So look for that, and that'll probably go out to you in the week before the webinar actually happens. So be well. Let's keep the conversation going. Yeah, so grateful. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Philip. Thank you.
Thank
Sorry.
you.
Thank you for joining us and sharing your information and
Yes.
with us. Such
Thank
an
you.
amazing catalyst for conversation.
I learned a lot from you all. Thank you.
We learned a lot from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for sticking around, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Nina.
Bye, guys.
Bye,
See
Nina.
you soon.
Can't
Great
wait.
job, everyone.
Veronica.
Veronica, Susie. All right. I think we
Anna
can
was,
stop.
I think Anna was saying that she wanted us to stick around, but I don't see her in the room. So maybe she wanted me to jump on a different one.
Oh, right.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
Do you want to stop recording?
Oh,
Oh,
yes.
yeah.
Thank you. See?
As I get into personal business.
Yes.